Well, it's the crime that has rocked a megacity and shocked the globe.
The promise of a new beginning. A new home, a new life, and a fresh start. That's what Maria envisioned when she agreed to move in with her fiancé, John. Their relationship had always been one of ups and downs, but Maria, like many people in love, believed in the potential of a brighter future. John, her fiancé, was a charming and charismatic man, qualities that initially drew her in. They had been dating for 2 years, and the decision to move in together felt like the next logical step in their relationship. The new house they purchased was meant to symbolize this fresh chapter. Maria was eager to start a family, build a future with John, and create the life she had always dreamed of. Little did she know that their new home would become the site of an unimaginable tragedy. The foundation of their relationship was built upon lies, manipulation, and hidden rage, and just days after moving in, it would all come crashing down. A horrific act of violence would take place within those walls, one that John would later try to justify as an accident, but the truth was far from that. Maria's dream of a happy future would come to an abrupt and tragic end. A history of troubling behavior, John's dark side. Before Maria ever moved in with John, there had been warning signs. John was no stranger to emotional manipulation and control. While he was able to charm his way into Maria's heart, there were subtle behaviors that raised red flags. Friends and family had noticed that he often displayed a possessive and controlling nature, but Maria was blinded by love and ignored the warnings. John had a history of unstable relationships, and his previous partners had expressed concerns about his controlling behavior and temper. Although he portrayed himself as an ideal partner, those who had been close to him saw a different side, a side that was far from the loving and caring persona he showed Maria. John's past was riddled with violent outbursts and incidents of aggression, but Maria had been unaware of the depth of his issues. Had she known about John's previous behaviors, she might have recognized the danger she was walking into. But like so many victims of abuse, she believed that things would be different with her, that their love would protect her from the darkness he harbored inside. The move-in, signs of trouble linger. As Maria and John settled into their new home, there were moments of unease that Maria couldn't shake. Although they had agreed on many aspects of the new house, Maria felt that John was becoming increasingly irritable and distant. He would snap at her over small issues. Things that seemed trivial to her would seem to set him off. Maria chalked it up to the stress of moving in together and starting a new life, but the tension between them began to build. John's mood swings grew more pronounced, and Maria noticed that he often became irrationally angry when she tried to bring up their future plans or any disagreements. She tried to placate him to smooth things over, believing that their love was strong enough to withstand any difficulties. However, deep down, she knew something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. The dream of a happy life in their new home was quickly turning into a nightmare, but Maria was still hopeful that things would settle down. Little did she know, the final fatal confrontation was fast approaching. The fatal night, an argument escalates. On the night of Maria's death, a seemingly small disagreement turned into something much more sinister. The couple had been arguing as they often did, but this time the tension was palpable. John was in one of his moods, and Maria, frustrated by his behavior, tried to defend herself. What began as a verbal disagreement quickly escalated into something far darker. John's anger flared, and his temper, which had been simmering under the surface for so long, finally erupted. Maria, trying to avoid conflict, attempted to back away, but John would not let it go. He grabbed her, and the situation quickly spun out of control. Maria, who had never imagined that John was capable of such violence, found herself trapped in a dangerous situation. Her attempts to break free were futile, as John's grip on her tightened. The argument, fueled by John's uncontained rage, turned into a life-or-death struggle, with Maria fighting for her life in the very home they had hoped would bring them happiness. In that moment, Maria's fate was sealed. The strangulation, a brutal act of violence. John's rage escalated to an unimaginable level as he attacked Maria. In a violent frenzy, he strangled her with his bare hands. The force of his grip was overpowering, and Maria, struggling to breathe, fought with every ounce of strength she had left. But it wasn't enough. The assault was relentless. The house, which was supposed to be a sanctuary, became a place of terror as John slowly and methodically took Maria's life. Strangulation is one of the most personal and brutal forms of homicide, as it requires the killer to maintain close physical contact with the victim, causing prolonged suffering. Maria, in her final moments, likely experienced a mixture of fear, disbelief, and a desperate desire to survive. However, she ultimately lost consciousness as her life was violently and senselessly snatched away from her. After killing her, John seemed to go into a state of shock, as if not fully comprehending what he had just done. In the aftermath of the brutal act, he would try to cover his tracks, but nothing could erase the horror of what had just transpired in their new home. The cover-up, John's efforts to hide the crime. After murdering Maria, John realized the gravity of what he had done, and panic set in. He immediately began to concoct a story in an attempt to explain Maria's death. He knew that the truth would lead to his arrest, but he was determined to avoid that outcome. His first attempt was to claim that Maria's death had been an accident. John insisted that during their argument, things had gotten out of control, and in the heat of the moment, Maria had died as a result of a physical altercation that escalated too far. He tried to make it sound as if her death was a tragic mistake, a consequence of a heated argument gone wrong. This narrative would become his defense, and he hoped that law enforcement would believe his story. However, there were inconsistencies in John's account from the very beginning. The authorities, upon arriving at the scene, quickly realized that Maria's death was far from accidental. John's explanation didn't hold up under scrutiny, and investigators began to piece together the true nature of the crime. The investigation. Unearthing the truth. As law enforcement began to investigate Maria's death, the cracks in John's story became more apparent. Investigators discovered that there was no evidence to suggest that Maria had been involved in any kind of physical altercation with John prior to her death. The autopsy revealed that Maria had been strangled, and there were no signs of defensive wounds or injuries consistent with a violent struggle. John's claim that the death was accidental didn't align with the forensic evidence, and this discrepancy raised suspicions among the investigators. Further scrutiny of John's past revealed a history of aggressive behavior, which had previously been overlooked. Family and friends came forward, revealing that John had exhibited troubling patterns of violent outbursts and controlling behavior during their relationship. The authorities began to see that Maria's death was not an accident, but rather the result of a carefully orchestrated act of violence. John's attempt to cover up the crime was unraveling, and it became clear that he was responsible for the death of his fiancée. John's arrest, facing the consequences. After a thorough investigation, the authorities had enough evidence to arrest John for the murder of Maria. He was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, as many were still trying to come to terms with the horrific nature of the crime. John's actions were incomprehensible, especially given the fact that he had once portrayed himself as a loving and caring fiancé. The reality of the situation was far darker. John had not only murdered Maria, but he had also attempted to manipulate and deceive everyone around him in an effort to avoid justice. His arrest marked the beginning of a legal battle that would ultimately see him held accountable for his actions. As the case progressed, Maria's family and friends were left to grapple with the senseless loss of a woman who had been full of promise and love. John, in his attempt to cover up his crime, had not only robbed Maria of her life, but had also caused immeasurable pain to those who loved her. John's attempt to defend himself. During the trial, John's defense team continued to push the narrative that Maria's death was an accident. They argued that John never intended to kill her, and that her death occurred as a result of a momentary lapse in judgment during a heated argument. However, the prosecution countered with a compelling case that exposed the lies in John's defense. They presented evidence of his violent history, his manipulative behavior, and the forensic details that proved Maria's death was no accident. John's actions leading up to the murder were painted as premeditated, and the jury quickly saw through his attempts to claim innocence. Throughout the trial, John remained stoic, offering little emotion as the details of his crime were laid bare for all to see. He tried to shift blame and evade responsibility, but the evidence was overwhelming. It became clear to everyone involved that John had murdered Maria in cold blood and was now trying to avoid the consequences of his actions. The sentencing, justice for Maria. In the end, justice was served. John was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence brought some measure of closure to Maria's family and friends, though no amount of justice could ever bring Maria back. The tragedy of her death would continue to haunt those who loved her, as they tried to come to terms with the senseless loss of a woman with so much potential. Maria's story serves as a heartbreaking reminder of the dangers that could lurk in even the most seemingly normal relationships. John's actions were the result of a toxic mix of control, violence, and deceit. Maria, in her desire for a better life, fell victim to a man who had nothing but darkness to offer. Her death is a tragic loss, but her story also stands as a cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing warning signs and seeking help before it's too late.